Hello, my fundraising friends. Welcome back to an episode of Two Peas on a Pod. Now, today's guest is Michael Birkin. You may not have heard of him. The fact is, he's incredibly well known in the corporate world, but he perhaps needs a short introduction for those of us who work in the charity field. Now, Michael is CEO of a company called KYU. Now, this is a global collective of creative companies that are focused on tackling some of the world's most complex problems by harnessing innovation to drive societal and economic change. Doesn't that sound exciting? But for the purpose of this podcast, he also served as CEO of Interbrand. Interbrand are one of the biggest global branding consultancies. And it was whilst he worked here that he developed the concept of brand valuation. He's also been vice chair of Omnicom, and obviously that's one of the world's largest advertising and marketing services firms. Now, Google him and you'll find he's one of the world's preeminent specialists on branding. He even helped write the book, Understanding Brands. And on today's episode of Two Peas on a Pod, he's here to discuss charity branding. Okay, what branding can do for charities and what it can't, when a rebrand should happen and when it shouldn't. And here's a few quick teasers of what we chat about.
We took a very bold approach to valuation, which was essentially to capture the vast majority of goodwill value under the label of brand. And I think that we at Interbrand already believed that. The rest of the world didn't at that particular point, and where much of the early conflict that I had to defend came from was over the validity of that particular approach. You might satisfy one constituency by making a branding change, but you're actually going to upset the maybe less fashionable constituency, but happens to be the one where most of your revenue is coming from. Then you need to think pretty long and hard about whether you want to make a change. If you've got really good people who have drive and energy, then they will make what looks like an old-fashioned brand work a lot better than a team of people who just make what looks like an expedient branding change to fix whatever they think their problem is. It's just not going to accomplish that. And I would say in the world of charities, which is a very competitive world for limited amount of money, it's even more so. It's seen as being an easy way to actually fix the problem rather than the real way to fix the problem. I think maybe the brand's its own worst enemy in that particular regard because of the idea of the category of branding being so ambitious. It's actually it's over-promoted itself as a way of fixing problems. It is a situation where somebody new has come in and somehow regarded a brand change as being the way forward. They do it and then they leave. I have very little time for that unless that has been an accidental set of circumstances. If that is their plan, then I think it doesn't stand up to any serious scrutiny. Ultimately, it's people that create dynamism and energy and success or failure, not labels or brands.
If you've ever been left scratching your head about the wisdom of yet another charity embarking on yet another rebrand, this podcast is for you. And if you're currently considering a rebrand for your charity, please watch or listen to this first, okay? Because you may just well save yourself a great deal of time and money. Because if your charity needs to raise more cash, a rebrand may well be the last thing you should do. Now, I recorded this interview a few weeks ago with my podcasting co-conspirator, as ever, the magnificent Giles Pegram, CBE, in our studio in the heart of London's Old Street. And it's actually part one of a two-part interview. In the second episode, to be published next week, we'll discuss what drives Michael's philanthropy, and that's going to be really interesting for anyone involved in high-value fundraising. But let's kick off today with the episode on charity branding. It's essential viewing for anyone with an interest in charity comms, and I hope you enjoy it. Michael, thanks so much for coming along. Now, one of the things about me that anyone in the sector knows is I love charity brands. but I am not a fan of charity rebranding. I see them as sometimes incredibly dangerous. What are your thoughts on how charities use their brand?
Well, clearly, I have to say that I think branding is a very important subject. I mean, I it would be disingenuous at best to say that I didn't believe in that, but that doesn't mean that I think that branding is necessarily a panacea for issues that any institution may have. I think if you could indulge me just for a moment to roll back to what we really mean by branding, and these days there's so many people that have their own opinion on that, but fundamentally a brand is essentially a shortcut of in the way you communicate the values of your organization to your stakeholders, customers, clients, employees, shareholders, other institutions, governments. And a decision that we took at Interbrand a long time ago, in the 1980s actually, was what set of values should a brand encapsulate? When we were looking at how you value a brand, we could have just taken a very narrow definition of what a brand was, essentially the trademark, the legal property that underpins the asset, and value that, which would have come up with an incredibly small valuation relative to the value of an organisation, and left most of the goodwill value in the hands of other intangibles, patents, copyrights, and indeed other aspects of business goodwill or institutional goodwill. But we didn't. We took a very bold approach to valuation, which was essentially to capture the vast majority of goodwill value under the label of brand. And I think that we at Interbrand already believed that. The rest of the world didn't at that particular point, and where much of the early conflict that I had to defend came from was over the validity of that particular approach, because essentially brand value started looking really not unadjacent to corporate value. But that has stuck as the approach, and to this day remains the approach. And it did change the world of branding significantly, because it brought the financial community into the world, because they saw the value of these assets and helped essentially grow the whole approach to branding. To move on specifically to, therefore, the role of branding in charitable institutions, and your specific question about what I think about it, the first thing I think to say is that it's no different in many respects to other institutions, other corporations. It is a way in which you can quickly communicate the values of an organisation. And it has both the ability to energize your organisation, it has the ability to communicate effectively with third parties, and therefore when things aren't going well, it's very tempting to say, well, because the brand decided to capture much of this value under that label, under this asset, therefore that is the problem, and therefore we should change it because that's clearly not working for us. There will be cases where that indeed is the case. There will be certain naming situations where it does become untenable to carry on calling institutions by the same name. I remember once when I was a lot younger driving through Wandsworth in the mornings, when I was a kid actually, and there was a hospital on the right that was the National Home for Incurables, and I always used to think that's a really difficult name. I remember having a conversation with my father, who was driving the car, sort of saying, surely they can't call this the Incurables. And he said, well, I don't think they're ready to change it because they think that it means something to people. I remember thinking, oh, I'm not sure I agree with that, but nonetheless, so be it. They ultimately did change the name because it was a brain surgery hospital, and they've changed it to something else now. Forgive me for not knowing it because I've been away a long time. And that might well have been a good reason to change the name and thereby the brand. But I think that when one looks at these situations, you've got to really understand yourself. You've got to understand what your organisation is doing. You've got to understand what it really means to people, and not just people who may have particular access to grind in the media or somewhere else about what they think you should do. You know, what should your organisation be doing, and who are the people who both support it now and the new people who will support it in the future? What are they looking for? And if you understand that, then that's a good place to start, because you may well find that what looks expedient or what looks like a move into a more sympathetic situation is in fact going to be destructive to your ability to drive revenue in the institution, in the charity. You've also got the other side of things, which is what's going on within your organisation and the symbolic nature of the brand in that environment and the need to make that change. I would argue that if you are going to go through profound change, there will be times when actually a new brand can really symbolise that change and energise people if it's properly introduced. But there are also many times when you don't need to do that. You actually have to say, we can energise our organisation without having to make that change. And if that's the case, and you also find on your own research that the truth is, you might satisfy one constituency by making a branding change, but you're actually going to upset the maybe less fashionable constituency, but happens to be the one where most of your revenue is coming from, then you need to think pretty long and hard about whether you want to make a change. So I think that it all comes down to a profound understanding of yourself and what really makes your institution work. And that's because branding has become so important.
One of the things that we find in the sector is that when organisations are rebranding, that what they're really talking about is a change of the visual ID. You know, there might be a change of name, but often it's that visual identity. And to my mind, when we look in the commercial sector, that doesn't happen that frequently. That it's a nuanced change. It might be, you know, the size of the logo or the rounding or a change in colour perhaps. But with charities, it's a dramatic one. If we look, for example, at Bernardo's, you know, a completely different change of brand ID, from, you know, something that was quite traditional to something that's radical different, but focused and developed with children. And to my mind, that you know, what's missing from that is the older people who give money, because often what they say to us when we're speaking to older people, you know, we've heard organisations that have gone through, you know, dramatic rebrands, and they've said to us, I don't hear much about them anymore. And it's almost like they're focusing on that younger dynamic because that younger dynamic reflects who they are. They might be in their 30s or 40s. To that end, is it the case that in effect that charities are working with two audiences perhaps, that both have different messages, need different messages? So on one hand, you've got the service users, so in terms of Bernardo's, the young people, we have to have one message for them, which is almost like, you can rely on us. But for the older people who are giving, the message almost has to be, we can't do this unless we can rely on you. How do you think we can match those two very, very distinct drivers in terms of developing a brand that works?
Well, every situation is different. That's a truism in life. I mean, if running a business was the same, then we could all just go out and buy the book and you would know the answer to the question, and we would all either succeed or fail depending upon the quality of the book. So I think that there inevitably are going to be different constituencies, and certainly in a world of 24-hour, 365-day-a-year news and social media, the number of messaging and voices that come at you are massive, and fundamentally we're in a very different world to the one that we were in. I think that the other truism, though, in life is that if you've got really good people who have drive and energy, then they will make what looks like an old-fashioned brand work a lot better than a team of people who just make what looks like an expedient branding change to fix whatever they think their problem is. It's just not going to accomplish that. And I would say in the world of charities, which is a very competitive world for limited amount of money, it's even more so. My own involvement some time ago with the NSPCC, I'm not up to date, having lived in the US for a while now, with it, I have to be honest, in the last 10 years or so. But certainly, even when I first started getting involved in 1984, I have no doubt there was a lot of conversations going on at the NSPCC about whether that name was still appropriate. Along with a lot of other names, Barnardo's, as you've mentioned, is one of them maybe, which are perhaps now sort of Victorian labels that seem to perhaps be dealing with a problem that may still exist, but exists in a somewhat different way, and is now confused by a lot of different messaging that comes through not necessarily of their own making. That leads people to say we've got to explain ourselves a little bit better. In my long experience, whether you're defining your own company or whether it's a charity, I don't think over definition or exactitude of definition is actually really that important at the end of the day. I think it's the way in which whatever it is that you are saying gets understood by the people you're dealing with. And therefore, I think why your own frustration may be there, and I would share your frustration, is because I think it's seen as being an easy way to actually fix the problem rather than the real way to fix the problem. I think and maybe the brand's its own worst enemy in that particular regard, because of the idea of the category of branding being so ambitious. It's actually it's over-promoted itself as a way of fixing problems. Yes, it can be symbolically incredibly important, and I certainly do believe there will be times when you should refresh. Whether you change the name is another matter, but only if you're doing all the work around it that actually enables it to mean more to the people that you're speaking to, rather than somehow it being the talisman from which it will do the work and you can then just come in on the back of it and do a better job. I'm not convinced that that has been the evidence in any aspect of commerce or philanthropy. So I think that my very strong advice is a deep understanding of the constituencies you have to deal with, a prioritization of that, and then an assessment of whether or not a brand refresh or redo or even a renaming in a more extreme case is really going to help you or not.
What do you think the circumstances might be where that rebrand, refresh might be useful?
I do think there are circumstances where, maybe fewer now, certainly over the last 30, 40 years, there will be certain Victorian establishments that have got names that have gone completely out of not just out of fashion, but genuinely inappropriate. I think I have a dear friend who has an apartment in New York, a lady, and she has a joke. She has a poster which from I think the 1800s, where it's sort of, you know, the home for mentally deranged women or something along those lines, and clearly, you know, that can't possibly work. I mentioned already the home and hospital for the incurables, which I think is probably not the message. Nobody, even if they are incurable, wants to go into an institution where they're labelled as incurable. And I seem to recall they did their very best for a while, saying until the incurables are cured, which actually I thought was quite clever. And but nonetheless, it's changed now. But of course, there can be circumstances where it's the name itself does need to change. But it's funny how aspects of the vernacular go in and out of fashion as well. One could look at homosexuality actually as a good example. Race is perhaps another, where labelling has changed over time, and maybe current labels in one or two places would have actually been regarded as rude, you know, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, but have somehow come back into fashion. So one has to be, I think the default should always be, no, we stay with what we have and really test the alternative, rather than essentially be easily persuaded that there should be a change. But I would argue that certainly when it comes to naming, I think inappropriateness has clearly got to be, you know, number one. But, you know, there are certain marginal cases. I mean, you know, the is it the Royal National Institute for the Deaf? Is that the name? I mean, I would argue that would be on the margin. I would say I'm not sure I would have been in the camp of wanting to change that, but I can see why people would. But I think it certainly needed to be a very full debate on that.
And you know what happened, of course.
I believe they changed and then changed again.
Indeed, they changed back,
yes.
because they realised that by losing that RNID, which had such strong brand recognition in the sector, and then turning themselves to Action for Hearing Loss, which had like zero brand awareness, they decided they'd made a mistake and went back to RNID. But I think they're now the RNID, and they're like keep off the deaf.
They just have the acronym. I mean, but that's certainly one obviously one area to do. The other, I actually think it's I think we all feed off energy. I mean, it's an incredibly important topic. I could give a whole podcast on post-COVID psychology and post-COVID tristesse and the damage that I think has been caused by COVID, which goes way beyond the physiological. So creating energy in your organisation is absolutely vital, and the brand plays a big role in that. Now, you know, do you need to change the brand to do that? No, not necessarily. But again, reflecting a comment I made a few minutes ago, I think that one has to start with the attitudes of the people running the institution and working in the institution and what is going on. And then I think, can the brand denote a set of change agents or a set of actions that demonstrate change and new energy? And if it can, then yes, I would argue that could be very, very helpful.
But that doesn't necessarily always get covered. As I said, one of the things that we always tend to find is a new visual ID, new set of ID rules that we have to apply. But as Giles and I, you know, often say, you know, perhaps the best part of to start a rebrand are the people who answer the phone when you call up. How do you get the finer nuances of what it is to be part of, for example, the NSPCC through that program? But that will be rarely covered in terms of a branding. It's this project, what it looks like. This is the new font. This is the new design. This is the new logo, and then that person who's introduced that tends to leave, and the whole process starts.
Well,
again.
I think clearly all forms of branding change is open for criticism, and normally is. Corporate identity changes are always criticised, or generally speaking so. I think that if you're running an organisation, you've got to understand your organisation, and you've got to. So, to me, I don't blame the chief marketing officer for that. I will blame the CEO for a change in that, because ultimately the CEO is the person who is going to make the decision whether they're going to allow that to happen or not. And I think that, sometimes I've found that I've looked at certain things and also looked at somewhat two-dimensionally and thought, why have they done that? And I don't actually like what I see. But then there can be a very, very good reason for it. I mean, it's a bit like, in the world of sport, why do certain football clubs buy certain players? And everybody has a comment on it and say, well, why do they need that player? And, they spent too much money, or this doesn't make any sense, or so-and-so's lost the plot. Well, maybe sometimes they have, but also if they're good at what they do, they know more about what's going on in that situation than we do, and there is a very good reason for it. So I think that if it is a situation where somebody new has come in and somehow regarded a brand change as being the way forward, they do it and then they leave, I have very little time for that, unless that has been an accidental set of circumstances. If that is their plan, then I think it doesn't stand up to any serious scrutiny. If, however, the organisation has been looking for change for a long time because it knows it needs to make it, and they've got very good reason for it, and this person is brought in and they affect the change, and then for whatever reason they decide they're going to leave, but they've been brought in on a plan, and because it's had that third dimension, then I think that's absolutely fine. But I think that it's, brands are not expedient. They are incredibly important symbols of a whole set of values that have to be properly understood.
I just want to pick up on the point Mark said about the person answering the switchboard, because I think I learned from you, tell me if I got this wrong, that a brand was about the experience of every stakeholder at every touch point in the organisation. So what happens to a person when they walk into an NSPCC office, and the way they're treated by the reception staff is as much a part of the brand of the organisation as the visual identity. Have I got that right?
No, totally right. I mean, that I think that Giles goes to some degree to the point I'm trying to make about how brands can create energy, and indeed are reflective of the energy of the organisation. So that is a vital component piece. I mean, and again, I think that an energised person who is calling on behalf of the NSPCC is going to succeed way more than somebody who is not as energised or charming or appropriate, who is promoting a new brand that doesn't necessarily sound as Victorian as one or two of the charities here still do. I think which comes back to the point that a branding change doesn't fix a problem in that sense. It comes down to the individuals. And I would even go further to say that, and this may be a personal opinion, because I'm a somewhat contrary individual sometimes, that I would be suspicious of an organisation that's just gone through a branding change, that actually, far from actually bringing me in, it would actually make me ask questions, why are you even doing that?
And that is exactly what donors tell us. It is exactly what donors tell us when they see that rebrand. How much did it cost? Why have you done this? It moves them out of the charitable world into the corporate one. And often we hear people talking about charities as companies. And is it why do you need this change? And particularly if you're in your 60s, 70s or 80s, it's almost like you value what that organisation has represented to you for the whole of your life, perhaps. But at this point of change, it's disrupted the relationship. Yeah. And it's a reason for you to think, should I continue?
Yeah.
And that becomes very, very powerful at a point of deciding about, should I leave an organisation a legacy, or should I even take a charity out of my will, which is one of the things that we've heard very recently. But I don't think that point of there is a risk is fully understood.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is a real conundrum, because ultimately, whatever your enterprise or institution, it needs to be run professionally. It needs to have the values that it needs to have, and it needs to be honest to those values, and it needs to be energetic around those values, and that applies to anybody. There are cases where that can get interpreted as building a bureaucracy, as essentially encouraging, people into a charity perhaps that don't necessarily really believe in it, but they see it as a job. And I think that's tough, because I think that we want to attract into the philanthropic world and into charities the best professionals we can. But one has to be very careful about what that means and where it spreads over into what constitutes the right and normal behaviour for those institutions. To some degree, US experience is awkward because of the way that the whole philanthropic world works there, and the sense that to some degree government relies on hugely wealthy people to form their own almost quasi-governmental attitudes to the world, and therefore they have the right, as it's their money, to operate under whatever basis they want. But it is essentially philanthropic, and a ton of amazing work happens. The way in which those organisations are structured are reflective of the individuals who are provided the funds, and nothing wrong with that. But one's got to be very careful about replicating that in a world where that is not the case, where essentially you're relying on individual donors who will be looking very firmly at what your administration costs are relative to what is being given, and therefore it's a very nuanced conversation. It is another area where I felt, from my own experience, CNSPCC, when I was very engaged with them in the 80s and 90s, were very, very good at. They professionalised significantly, but not in a way where they lost their identity or their approach or their sense of responsibility. These days in the UK, I'm not close enough to be able to comment, but I can quite understand why donors would be a little concerned about branding changes and what's really going on behind it, and whether that particular institution is focusing on the wrong areas.
And as I said, it's something that we see time after time when a rebrand happens. And being a bit of a geek, I track income. So you look at levels of income given via individuals, depending on what the annual report offers, or legacy income. And so often after a rebrand, you see this drop. And that drop can last for 3, 4, 5 years before it starts to rise again. And to my mind, a strong brand can be such a powerful tool to actually help you not just gain and retain donors, but also to get over your core message that it's why it's that those brands that, you know, have value, and they might have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years value, can be cast aside. Is, you know, is my key worry. Because, you know, if you had a brand that was, say, 50 years old, you know, I'm trying to come up with something now that's 50 years old in the UK to give us an example, and an organisation suddenly does, you know, that massive change. It was a bit like Consignia. I don't know if you have an opinion on when Royal Mail was going to divide into two groups, and it went from Consignia, and then suddenly it was, you know, it was back to normal. How does that happen as some form of you know, huge mistake?
Well, you already alluded earlier on to the issue that exists around the short tenure of certain executives in certain roles, and the need to leave a stamp, positive or negative, on the situation they're in, and the ability to parlay that change positively in their next role. So part of why that happens is to do with individuals and their own personal ambitions.
Not to put it down, not to find a point, not to put too fine a point on it.
Yeah, not for sure, but certainly. But I do think having been, you know, definitely one person who I suppose had quite a bit to do with the rise of the brand and its importance. Maybe just because I'm getting older, I also have seen it metastasize or morphed, or maybe I could try to use a less pejorative word, but nonetheless into, you know, a sense of its own power. And ultimately it's people that create, you know, dynamism and energy and success or failure, not labels or brands. Because brands, to Giles's earlier question, essentially, if they're positive, are denoting all the values of the institution, including the interaction, and most importantly, I would argue, the interactions of the front line. I think why these changes happen is because a lot of bad work is done, a lot of bad analysis is done. I think a lot of people assess situations, sometimes out of a self-serving wish to get a job, whether it's a consultancy firm or whether it's an individual, and look at aspects of change that maybe needs to happen. But like anything else in life, it's always the third dimension. You know, it may be that, to take the sporting analogy that I used earlier on, you know, you can buy a player for a football team who might be a brilliant player for 5 other clubs, but for your particular club isn't going to work because of all the reasons that we all obviously understand. They don't fit into the system, their personality doesn't fit with the culture of the club for whatever reason. You know, they don't live in the country, and they don't want to actually live in the place where they are. Oh, there's a whole raft of reasons, and everybody comments about, you know, what they think is the rights and wrongs of the whole thing. But ultimately, whether that player has been a good buy is down to the understanding of the management and the ownership of the club about itself, about whether or not it's right for them. And I think in our world, it's, and I suppose I embrace all aspects of the commercial and philanthropic world to some degree. It's the same thing. What is the right thing for that particular organisation? And just because somebody else has done something and have made a success of it, doesn't mean you're going to make a success of it. Or they've done something and failed means that if you do it, it's going to fail. You've got to present, you know, the in-depth case. And I think that if people do that, and they understand the work that's required to make it work, then okay. But most people don't do that, I'm sorry to say, and that's why I think your evidence that after branding changes, revenues often or donations go down has been the case. And so I think that, yes, I believe in the power of brand more than ever, but that doesn't mean that I believe in changing brands. In fact, on the contrary, I believe it's about, before you start looking at it, look at yourself and say, what am I not doing that I need to do? And then if a brand can help me in demonstrating a change legitimately and we can communicate it in the right way to stakeholders, okay. But I would argue that that's the minimum, that would be the minority cases. The majority cases, the fix is with what you've got. And or what you might call a modest change that doesn't impact the donors because they won't think you've spent millions doing it, but actually is able to energize in the right way.
That's great. I was gonna ask you to sum up with a couple of tips for anyone considering it.
One silly question. Supposing, given what you said, in our previous podcast, I said that Apple was valued at £1 trillion. Its brand was valued at £1 trillion. So supposing someone came in as the new CEO of Apple, so Apple's a bit down. Let's call ourselves Pears. Am I right in thinking that the company would lose £1 trillion of its value, essentially?
Well, no. It's because I think that the way that brands work, that the value isn't all in the name. That
of course.
It's first of all, it's not a serious question, Giles, in the sense of nobody would do that, and you know that. We all know that. But it's interesting, actually, as a question as to what would happen. Essentially, a brand. The reason why brands are so valuable is that they actually capture a whole raft of individual values, customer interactions, the quality of the product, the attitude of design to the whole thing. There's a employee engagement. There's a lot, and they were designed that way. The name is one aspect of is one part of that capture, I suppose. So let's take your question. So you change it to a pear. So yes, you'd probably have to change the logo to a pear. Otherwise, it really would look. Although I suppose in today's world that might be quite interesting. Maybe they can redesign the pear to become the apple. I don't know because.
Certainly generate a lot of news.
It would generate a lot of news, and I suppose we all use the expression pear-shaped to mean something's gone wrong. So you probably want to redesign the pear to an apple. But
a stupid question.
No. But as a serious answer to the question, the reality is, to what degree can you transfer the values that are encapsulated in the Apple name and get-up in a new name and get-up? And the answer is a lot of them would transfer across. So in other words, it's not the brand, it's not what a lot of people see as the brand, which is the name and the identity that has the value in and of itself. It's all the values that are wrapped up inside it, which can be transferred, if properly managed, with a new name and get-up. The problem is not everybody understands that quite in that way and thinks that somehow there's an automatic transfer that takes place from one to the other. And the answer is it is not automatic. You've got to work really, really hard at it. So could you maintain the value? Yeah, it costs you a lot of money. I mean, I don't know how many hundreds of millions it would cost you to, or billions possibly, to do the transfer. So it's an insane decision, which, as you know. But it doesn't mean it all falls away. They're fragile things, but not actually so much because of the get-up and the name, more because of all the values that go within it. And that's where the hard work has to happen.
And that, of course, is what you've been saying for the last half hour. Mark, I interrupt you. You're going to ask, I think, a closing question.
No. I was just really going to summarise that my closing question was going to be, what are the tips? But in that previous question, your answer to that previous question, I think you gave them anyway. So unless there's anything you would want to add, I think we're pretty much time's up.
Well, I think, Mark, I think my tip is, understand yourself. I mean, that's bit of an obvious one, but it's amazing how I found the simple things in life most people just don't do. I mean, in this post-COVID world, people think they can win business by Zoom calls. They think they can manage by, virtually. They can't. If I look at the portfolio of companies that I oversee these days, I manage overseas, the ones that are showing up are doing better than the ones that aren't. It's that simple. It always was. Even, half of winning is showing up adage is alive and kicking more than ever, I would argue. Even walking over from Old Street just now, I've been asked to, work as a bit of a pitch doctor for one of our companies on a piece of business, and I've just asked for the background, and the first thing I heard is that it's a Zoom call. I said, well, I can tell you right now what my first comment's going to be. I don't care what the client or potential client's saying about showing up or not. We are going to show up. Mm-hmm. And so that's an obvious, point to make. But when it comes to brand and brand changes, it does come down to, if you really understand yourself and you're honest with yourself about your own deficiencies, then start there. And if the brand can really help you on the back of the hard work you need to do to change things or to fix things or to move things forward, then go for it. But don't think that somehow you can avoid all of that and the brand is somehow going to do the heavy lifting for you, because it just isn't. And so it's sort of, I wouldn't say it's the last chance saloon, but it's definitely only a way of capturing all the change that you need to make and maintaining the value in the organisation. It is not a change agent that is going to resonate well with people without a ton of work that goes with it.
Michael, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. We've had 2 great sessions. I can't say how grateful I am for you giving us so much time when you would probably be charging companies tens of thousands for that. So thank you so much for what you've given to us. And it's been a real joy for me.
It's a pleasure, Mark.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank
Charles,
you, Michael.
lovely to see you as always.
See you in a couple of years.
Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed.